Good morning, everybody, and thanks for being here, and thanks to all three of you. It's such a pleasure, and I'm really looking forward to having this conversation. So, all three of you have been through catastrophic natural disasters in your cities, in your regions, at different times, and have had to deal, obviously, with the aftermath of recovery. And that has involved just a lot of political and human challenges, and not just infrastructural and natural ones. And so I'd like to sort of try to flesh that out in different ways and talk about really what the obstacles have been for you, but also what the opportunities are when you face these kinds of calamities, to rethink your cities, your regions, rebuild them in some way that is better. Or at least more suited to a changing climate and a changing situation. So I just wanted to say, as we're talking, we're going to talk for a little while. If you could think of some questions, I'm going to leave some time at the end, about 5 minutes, for some pithy questions and hopefully pithy answers and no statements. And maybe we can get a few in, which would be great. So let me begin with you, Mayor Cantrell. Here we are in New Orleans, and you've now been in office for 7 months?
Yes.
Right, so I'm sure everything you wanted to get done is now done, and you're moving on to a second agenda.
Well, definitely the one thing is, they say, oh, you kick the can, you kick the can. Well, I'm the woman who's bending over to pick up the can. and whatever's in there, we're going to deal with it and address it. But on a serious note, in regards to whether it's lessons learned, when Katrina hit, I was on the ground. I was a community leader. I led the recovery of my community, which led the city in recovery, grassroots all the way. So when I think about it from that perspective, it's one, understanding that your neighbors are your first responders. Emergency preparedness is people, right, as well as property. So we embraced, better than before, embraced flood mitigation practices, even before, at the time, government caught up.
Yeah.
Now, government, from the council to mayor, our city has embraced stormwater management practices, having an urban water plan in place, knowing exactly who our vulnerable residents are, getting them out of harm's way, but also having to rethink strategy as other storms come. So when I think about Michael, it just hit. Well, from our preparedness standpoint, or the hour that we activate, well, we would have been behind, because Michael came so fast.
Yeah.
And so you always have to be prepared. And it's not a matter of if, truly it's when.
So, but let me just ask you, you mentioned you sort of came to prominence here in the city protecting Broadmoor. Mm-hmm. And Broadmoor was one of the green dot areas in the city. Green dot meaning it was designated essentially by people who had come here to decide how to protect the city in the future as a place that should be turned into a green zone for water management. So, and I want to also ask this question as well of Mayor Cruz. So there's a tension built into this whole question. It came up last night in a conversation as well between kind of water strategies that make some sense, especially as climate change rises, and the community's desire to stay in place. Obviously, in New Orleans, you have major infrastructural problems. You have rising sea issues. What do you say now that you're mayor in communities that are in vulnerable places? You can do a lot with preparedness and so forth, but you do have to think long-term as well about how people can really live with water in areas which, maybe would be better off or would be in some way logically turned into green areas. How now, from community to mayor, has that changed in your perspective?
Well, one, it's recognizing that you have to look at stormwater management like as a system. You can't pump your way out of it, so it's not just pumps and power. It's also holding that rainwater, keeping the flow from going into the drains faster, raising your homes above the flood line. There are many different strategies that you have to implement, and we have here. But clearly, if the levees breach, right, that was a problem. They failed. So the Broadmoor community actually was not underwater, but when the levees failed, we took the water and we held it for over 3 weeks. So it's a combination, but you have to look at it as a system.
Yeah. Carmen, I'm sorry, Mayor Cruz, you're nodding during this because you, in San Juan as well, have a lot of communities which are very strong. They're informal communities.
They're organized.
And they're organized, and they don't necessarily want to leave, but they're not going to get federal money now, which is coming in to do new housing and infrastructure because they're in the floodplain. What's your answer to this quandary about what to do with communities which are very strong and have been there for generations, don't want to leave, are in flood zone areas?
Well, there's a couple of things that you have to look at. First of all, is the standard operating procedures for the federal government to manage cities that are in coastal areas and so forth don't necessarily apply. So that has to be relooked at. The Stafford Act that gives life to FEMA tells you that if they give you $1, you have to use it exactly to replace what you have. So if you had a house that was in a flooded area, you cannot rebuild the house above the flooding area level because it's not allowed. Not only that, you have to deal with people that don't have deeds.
Right.
So there are different ways. You have to sort of fly the plane and fix it at the same time while engaging in a battle for massive gentrification, which is happening and which we have held up in San Juan. Because people come in, they speculate, they buy plots of land, they want to change the zoning laws. And what seems to have not been good for the poor and the disenfranchised, all of a sudden it's good for those that have money and those that want to push a different agenda together. So we work very close with communities to ensure that there are even areas within those communities that are not in the flooding area. And we work very close with them to ensure that there's relocation and not gentrification.
So, Judge Emmett, these are echoing some of the issues obviously have come up. You mentioned earlier today when we were just chatting the question of you set new regulations which require people to raise their homes. Some of those people can't afford to do that. How does the situation compare in an area like Houston?
Well, first let's talk about Houston and Harris County and that entire urban area. Houston's less than half of the population of Harris County. We have a lot of people who live, almost 2 million, who live in unincorporated Harris County. That's an arm of the state. We don't even have ordinance making power.
Meaning that you, even though you're the head of Harris County, cannot actually tell people in your own county how they will regulate their own.
Not directly.
Uh-huh.
And part of our biggest problem, there's no way to sugarcoat it. The structure of government that we have doesn't work.
Yeah.
The city of Houston years ago annexed strips, and it put all of the county into their ETJ. So their city planning commission has control sort of over the county, but not really. But it's not part of the city. But the biggest problem is we were slow learners. I'll be the first to admit that. We had a tax day and a Memorial Day flooded the same areas over and over, and then Harvey came with 50 inches and the whole county went under. And when that happened, 160,000 homes flooded. 105,000 of those homes were not in the floodplain. Well, they were in the floodplain, they just didn't know they were in the floodplain because it wasn't defined as a floodplain.
Right.
So to your point, we now have updated our regulations, the city of Houston has, so has Harris County, about what you can do in a floodplain, but if we don't know where the floodplains really are, it's a meaningless thing.
FEMA has not given you those new numbers yet.
And they're working on it, but it's going to be 4 or 5 years.
So people are still building in the floodplain, and they'll be building to new regulations, but the new regulations won't actually coordinate with the...
Yeah, let me just sort of conclude this little segment before everybody starts jumping in. We're the Wild West in a way. We were going to tame nature by gum, and we're going to build and we're going to keep growing. Well, there comes a point where you go, nature wins, and you need to stay out of nature's way. And so now we've got to get really serious about not building in flood. You're talking about building in floodplains. We had people actually build in the floodway.
Yeah.
Totally nonsensical. One of our major buyouts, was in an area that was in the San Jacinto River, basically. Should never have been there.
Right.
And so we've got to look, but Houston doesn't have zoning.
Yeah.
So Harris County doesn't have zoning. So if we don't have zoning, and the state of Texas is,
Yeah.
freedom.
I mean,
And to what the judge says, it's very important because, this is about people. We talk about climate change and we talk about rising sea levels and about how many inches of water. We lost in Puerto Rico 50 million trees between Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Maria, and there was a historical tide right in the middle, smack in the middle. So it was a 1, 2, 3. But it's about people. It's about people that lose their homes, that lose their livelihood, that lose their ability to make a living. So climate change isn't, and I know there's people out there that still think about this, but it isn't fake. It isn't about, don't smile, it's the truth. It isn't fake news. It's about people losing their lives. In our case, it's about more than 3,000 people who died. It's about at least 45,000 homes to this day that still have a blue roof or a tarp. It's about 500,000 people having to migrate and leave. And you know very well in Katrina that happened, and things have never really been the same. And you had a tour yesterday.
Well, we're not at our pre-Katrina levels just yet in terms of population. We're continuing, to grow. We're now at about 400,000. We were over 440.
But I thought the poverty levels have returned to pre-Katrina levels. So you have, and this gets to a point, because you were raising, you do have an interesting dynamic. You mentioned gentrification between a population coming in and tension between a population coming in. That's a new tax base, which you need for doing stuff like infrastructure and so forth, and communities that are worried about displacement, many of them in these vulnerable areas. How do you reconcile this kind of tension?
Well, one is helping the people return home and also rebuild, and having policies and practices in place that actually do that. We have context matters now. We're 13 years away, but in that moment, people got screwed. The policy in terms of how you would activate federal money that flowed through the state of Louisiana, then that were put in place. They took your pre-Katrina value of your home that determined how much money you would get, and most folks got screwed with that when sheetrock costs the same.
Yeah.
So if you have a 2,600 square foot home, regardless of where you live, sheetrock costs the same. And so there were differences made that had an impact on people.
Right.
So although we have seen neighborhoods even come back, also deal with the balance, some clearly have been gentrified, but that's where really government being intentional on the front end can help curb that. But when government shows up 5 years later, it's hard to infuse the balance on the front end.
But what kind of a city do you, in order to create a New Orleans that is wealthy enough and healthy enough to grow and to fix its problems at the same time, what do you say to people? You came out of a community that was worried about displacement. What do you say to people who feel like there's a tension between the way New Orleans is growing economically or should grow economically and the threat to those neighbors? It's not specifically about climate necessarily or rising waters, but it's related to it.
It's about disparity, and the gaps that we knew existed even pre-Katrina absolutely are playing out in this post-Katrina environment where the gaps actually have grown. The cost of living has grown significantly. And then you have to think about the 18+ historic districts we have that puts another layer of guidelines on people to rebuild to a certain level, which costs.
Yeah.
So we, government now, really have to be, again, intentional with gap financing options, helping people stay in their homes, stay in their communities, so it will not be gentrified.
And it also has to do with education.
Absolutely.
There comes a point in time where children in Puerto Rico, thank you so much, Judge. Children in Puerto Rico took about 6 to 8 months to get back to a full day at school.
Yeah.
And most parents said, well, I'm going to try and take my child away if you were sick. But there's this thing, and I see Mayor Tubbs in the audience. It's something we were talking about last week. There's climate justice. It is the disenfranchised. It is the communities that are the poorest. It is those that have been targeted, laser focused on people getting them out of there, that are the ones that suffered the most. And they learn and they teach going forward because they became their first responders. We have started a thing called CCT, Centers for Community Transformation. And we take an old building, we only have two more are being built, an old building, and we put everything you need there for 1 month's worth of taking care of yourself and your community. Enough for a soup kitchen to spring up and feed everybody. For people to put their insulin. A lot of people in Puerto Rico died because their insulin went bad and they couldn't use it. Nebulizers for children. Yep. So we give the community that is already empowered everything they need to move forward and to be their first responders while government has a chance to clear up the roads and get to where they need to.
So, and is the federal government going to help produce more of those centers? Is your governor on board with a plan to do that widely, or is it just an experiment?
Today, there's other mayors going to San Juan to see the one that we're going to inaugurate next week, but we've been doing it with local money or with non-governmental organizations helping. FEMA likes to control the money and likes to control everything. I had right? Oh, yeah. And they take it through so many levels and layers that by the time the money gets to you, and you hear all these, $1.5 billion for Puerto Rico for housing. Well, the money hasn't gotten there.
Right.
Well, and that's one thing that Houston and Harris County, we've been able to convince the federal government and the state government to give us direct allocation so that we don't have to go through some of the hoops. But we have a fundamental problem. Let's talk about twofold. Number one, we have to go back and look at our whole flood management system. For the longest time, the idea was you concrete line all the bayous. We have 22 major watersheds in Harris County. Well, that turns out to be the wrong approach, and so we've been changing that in advance. So we're getting better at how we manage floodwaters. But when we start talking about buyouts, if you're talking about LMI, low moderate income housing, we can buy people out. Say you give them $100,000 for their home in Harris County. There's no place for them to go to buy a home anywhere close in. So if they go out to the far suburbs, then we don't have a robust enough public transit system to get them back to their jobs. The kids are out of the schools. So that's the dilemma we're facing right now. And it's one of those things that, and when I jokingly said, state of Texas is big on freedom, they always have been, but sooner or later the state of Texas has to realize it's not this rural western cowboy state, it's an urban state. Think of the major population centers in Texas. You got Houston, you got San Antonio, you got Dallas-Fort Worth, you've got Austin now, which is growing just tremendously. El Paso, we are an urban state, but unfortunately the state government hadn't caught on yet to realize that. So Mayor Turner, people like me, Judge Eckhart over in Travis County, we're trying, but until we change the fundamentals of the way we're governed in the state of Texas, it's always going to be a problem.
And I think we all share something. You have to change people's mindset. When you don't have electricity, you want it from wherever. You don't care if it's fossil or non-fossil. So we have to make sure that we tell them, yes, but you don't want to go through this again. In Puerto Rico, our grid is still very weak, so a couple of times a week, people don't have any electricity. And understand, we don't want to take hot showers or air condition. We want to be able to operate without having to use the light on your cell phone. So that is the level. So you have to convince people. We call it in San Juan, and we're on a crusade for looking for permanent solutions to recurring problems.
But you also, when you mentioned, educate, and my greatest challenge here is finding adequate revenue to fully implement our urban water plan, for example, to talk about those flood waters and capturing it, and even capturing it on private property as well. But, when I think about, for example, $166 million a year off of lodging and hotel taxes, that the city gets 1.5% of that, that's a problem. So change has to come.
We don't get any.
That's not just at the federal level, but where I'm at, it's at the city level and state level as well, because New Orleans needs just a little bit more of what she generates so that she can take care of herself, take care of her families.
Yeah.
Because we have to ensure that people are safe from floodwater.
See, you just hit my hot button. When I talked about the county, those 2 million people that live in unincorporated Harris County, we don't get any sales tax. We exist entirely on the property tax. There's not a more hated tax in the world than the property tax. And all the state leaders, if you watch this year's campaign, they all run for office, elect us, and we're going to lower your property tax. State doesn't even have a property tax. So what they're saying is we're going to make local government lower the tax. Fortunately, this past summer, after Harvey, we had a $2.5 billion bond election where we said, you know what, we want you to raise your property tax so we can do a better job of flood mitigation, and it received 86% approval.
Yeah, I thought that was extremely interesting and a very important point, that once people had gone through Harvey, even though that is the line, property taxes will be lowered, people were willing to do that because they thought those protections are in the long run an economic benefit.
Absolutely.
An economic benefit to
But
us.
at the state level, we still have, there will be a plethora of bills filed in the legislative session to mandate lower property taxes at the local level.
Well, and this gets into this tension I was mentioning earlier between often things that happen at a state level or a federal level and what you need at a local level. And that you have a very red Texas state legislature.
It's less red now than it was before November.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, you're right on it.
I'm living proof of that.
Yeah, nonetheless,
But
that's a
it's
tension,
important
right?
Because it's the same pattern. It is the upper level of government that doesn't provide direct services or provides even less direct services, taking the lower level of government's income or abilities to make income, so that we provide the services, but then they take the money. I'll give you a very quick example. There was a law passed last year. It's called Pay As You Go for retirement. Our retirement system is all in shams. The city of San Juan went from paying $4 million a year to $51 million a year, and it's going to increase every year. So of course, I'm fighting that at every level. And immediately that puts me into my surplus that I had in the city that I could use and invest in making sure that families had resilient homes and so forth, now becomes a deficit because I have to put it in my books as something that I'm fighting, and that's supposed to go up on a yearly basis. So it is the struggle of how do you maintain your autonomy, but at the same time have an issue of interdependence.
And I'm sorry, yeah,
Well,
please.
and also, I mean, when you think about New Orleans, a world-class city, destination city, right? We had over 18 million visitors over this past year. So when you think about that and think about the revenues generated off of that, but that do not come through city coffers to fix infrastructure that our industry needs, it's the industry not only that's driving New Orleans, but it drives the state of Louisiana. So infrastructure happens to be important for all. And therefore here, those dollars need to be reinvested in the infrastructure that we all need to survive.
And I think that climate change also takes the veil off of people's eyes. I often said that in Puerto Rico, we will no longer be able to hide our poverty and our inequality behind palm trees and piña coladas. I mean,
that's right.
Seriously, most of the palm trees went away, first of all, and all of a sudden you can see it raw. So while people go by the Golden Mile, which is where all the banks are, they literally look down and perhaps just saw a lot of beautiful trees. But therein lies what we call the G8. 8 communities, disenfranchised, impoverished, that have one of the highest working labor levels in all of Puerto Rico, even though their poverty level is amongst the highest.
Right next to the richest neighborhood, you're saying.
Next to the richest neighborhood. And now you cannot hide from that. You have to see it, you have to confront it. So climate change forces you to look at things not only like water management, but education, the educational system, the infrastructure, the workforce management, and it really forces you to look at life in a different way.
Let me, before the little bit of time we have left, just in a general sense, Cantrell, do you feel the city has come out better than it was before Katrina? all things added up.
Well, what I will say, it was definitely a horrible opportunity to do some things better than we did before. One, just being prepared, understanding that we have to live with water. That's a big deal.
Yep.
And we see it reflected in how people are capturing their water and how we're trying to educate them in that regard. It also, in terms of, and going back to the mayor, it forces you to address your disparities that existed.
Yeah.
And so those social ills that plagued you, pre-Katrina had to be embraced in the post-Katrina environment, and looking at how holistically how we can build a better quality of life for all of our people. You cannot push it to the side. You mentioned in one of your opening statements how poverty seemed to come back. Well, I wasn't of the belief that poverty wouldn't come back, because what that message sent to our people was that they were not welcome back to the home that makes this city so special.
Right. And Judge Emmett, I mean, in many ways, the conversation about Houston has been, it came back, quickly and well. It's a much more complicated story, yeah?
Well, it's not back as well as people might think because of the things I just mentioned. We still have a lot of people that are going to be bought out, and where do they go to live? But I do think two benefits came of it. Number one, the idea that we're not going to keep fighting with Mother Nature, that we're going to find a way to save the Katy Prairie and designate lands that you can't build on. But we got to figure out how to do that. But we still have to answer the question of how the levels of government work together. My favorite example is the state of Texas has what they call a rainy day fund with $12 billion in it. They did not tap that fund to help local government. And I'm sitting, pardon my French.
Oh, bring it on. Bring it on.
If Harvey wasn't a rainy day with 50 inches of rain, I don't know what the hell is.
Right.
Yep.
And the state of Texas wouldn't tap that fund. They said, well, we'll do it in January. Well,
Yep.
that's a year and a half after Harvey.
Yep. And in San Juan, obviously, you're still suffering.
Well, we're still struggling, but we are coming out of this with eyes wide open and with an awakening of things that need to be done, inserting ourselves into conversations that we didn't have. I'm in this crusade of making people love solar power.
Oh, yeah.
And every home that we rebuilt in San Juan with either municipal money, we make sure that it can completely function off the grid, that it's completely solar powered, and that people have the ability to take those panels out. We're doing a project with the Clinton Foundation of taking and solarizing the largest urban market in Puerto Rico, where about 300 small businesses just couldn't work and couldn't function. So the livelihood of people, and making sure that people understand that they can come back, that this is their home.
Right. And
that it's waiting for them with its lights and with its shadows, but that we're pushing on and we're moving forward.
Thank you so much. We have just a short period of time. Are there any questions out there we can? Yeah.
How do you overcome the politics of recovery? Each of you have a president that has declared that everything is done and has done the best job and you don't need anything more. And so that each of your motivations for anything new is going to be questioned, and you're going to be pushed back from a federal government who believes everything's satisfied. So how do you overcome the politics of it?
Let me jump into that first. The federal government really isn't our problem. In Houston and Harris County, they've actually been fairly forthcoming. And like I said, Houston and Harris County are able to get a direct allocation. I think it's too easy to say, well, the bad guy up there in the White House. No, we need to look at our own state, and we need to look at what happens there, because I think that's our bigger problem in Texas rather than the federal government.
Well, and I'm going to have to jump on that too now, Judge, because at the federal level, I will have to say this. Bottom line is the city of New Orleans did get federal dollars, still have them. My job, I have to get those dollars out of the door and get infrastructure projects moving in the city of New Orleans, the dollars that were not spent by previous administration. The other piece is that I'm playing to the strength of the federal government that is focusing on infrastructure. Congress even says that that's going to be a top priority. Absolutely. The opportunity zones, as well. We have to play to our strengths here. We don't have time to be focusing on what's not, but pushing what can happen. That's what I'm doing here.
You ignore the voices of doom and you push on, because there are people that listen. Look, in my worst, darkest day, there were people from the city of Houston that sent us money, teachers, $25. There are students from New Orleans that went to San Juan. The people from New York City consistently went from September till December. Mayor Bill de Blasio sent them out. So you grab on to those that have a heart, that have an open mind, and that know that this is a time to push together. Yesterday, I sent a group of people to the Dominican Republic. There was a huge explosion. There's hundreds of people that are not accounted for yet. So you pay it forward, and you make sure that you tap into those communities. And it is the community, and it is the people. We sometimes tend to talk about this because we need to win billions of dollars in infrastructure, but this is about people. This is not about politics. This is about saving lives, so we have to work very hard to get politics out of the way and push on. And we have a saying in Spanish, uno ara con los bueyes que tiene. You know, you work with, I guess in English would be, you work with the horses that you have. And it hurts, because it hurts when you get paper towels thrown at you, when you needed something else. But the world sees people for what they are, true colors come out, and you just push on with those that have a mindset of solidarity and collaboration.
You got to look at that money. Where is it? Locally, even at the state level. That's why I drive in terms of this, what's generated right here in New Orleans and what doesn't go back into infrastructure and that reinvestment. It's critical. So it's asset recycling. Look at how we have to change. We have to change locally and at the state level based on revenue here to even make the case at the federal level. You know, you gotta put some skin in the game.
I know we're out of time, but my bottom line is we need to let local officials make the decisions of how to get that money out and where to best use it.
That's right.
That's the bottom line.
That's right. I like you.
Well, thank you. Does that mean I can come back?
Yes, you can.
Show me the money.
I
Right?
see, yeah. I want to thank all three of you. I'm so sorry. There are big zeros up here, so we've run out of time.
You didn't
Thank you
call
so
us big
much.
zeros.